what I'm going to show you now isn't in the manual, and it's a way to deal with changing out a broken trip line or a broken spring reel, or if you need to change out some of these components because they're too worn, you can take the entire assembly out by removing these two bolts here and these cotter pins, and you can remove this whole assembly here right from the control head and replace it with a brand new set of linkages. We provide these from the factory pre-assembled, even with the springs and the stop bolts attached, and so you just plug and play. You drop it back in and you've basically refreshed the whole guts of your control head. But in order to do that, the trip line has to come out because the trip line is tied in through this barrel here. So what I'm going to show you is a shorter way of changing out this trip line. This is very simple. You just have to be careful that you wear good nitrile gloves. Again, if you get a control head like that one over there that was very slippery from lubricant, you're going to need gloves. You're going to be out there in the heat, your hands will be sweaty, and you'll be trying to hold this spring reel. So again, you're going to remove that shackle from the adjustment chain. Make sure you take a jiffy marker, and I'll show you on this one here. This one is set to the second 7th link. So you can either keep that number in mind or you can mark it with a jiffy marker, and then you don't have to think about that again. You do want to set it back to where it came off because this controls your valve on the other end of the bucket. That controls how the valve seals, and it controls how much udder is showing at the bottom of the bucket when the bucket's full of water. So you do want to mark that point. On our training example here, it's already removed, and the reason for removing this is because as it comes off the spring reel, there's going to be a natural twist to the cable. If any of you have tried to put a hose back on a round hose storage rack, you got to work out the twist in the hose as it goes back into a round shape. It'll tend to want to twist up. Same thing when it comes off, and it's the same thing with cables and any other type of braided rope. So here we are holding the spring reel in place, and hand over hand we're pulling off all of this line just carefully and making sure we have a good grip on the spring reel with each hand before letting go with the other. Pull the spring, the trip line off the spring. Until you're at the safety swage. This swage is there to block that trip line from coming out of the control head. There are some cast pieces right here that would block that swage from trailing out behind out of the control head if it comes off of the spring reel. So by holding that safety swage up, you prevent it from binding in this spot here between the spring reel and the solenoid. So I generally hold it vertical like this and use my other hand as a brake to let the spring slowly unwind until it's in a neutral position. And the more it unwinds, the safer it becomes. It's not, it doesn't have nearly as much energy. So now we have all the trip line unwound off the spring reel, and it's still here through the trip block. And as we said, it's got to come out of the trip block before you can change this trip line, before you can change the spring reel, or before you can change this whole trip block linkage assembly. And the easiest way to do that, now that it's neutral, there's no tension in the spring, is to simply turn it over and go to the nut that's on the back. It's a 3/4 nut, and a box end wrench is all you need. There is a hex opening here to hold the shaft in place, but if you don't have that size and all you have are some box end wrenches, you can accomplish that same thing by holding the spring reel firm to the base, because there is another set of cast lugs underneath, and there's a plate that is on the shaft, and that will stop it from turning as long as you're holding it in place. So again, 3/4 inch box end is better because the shoulder on the nylock nut is fairly shallow. Some sockets may not get a good grip on that, and I find a box end wrench works much better. So you've now removed that nut, that's on the back, your shaft is free, and you can now wiggle that off, and you can see that there's a metal tab on here, and that locks right between these two cast pieces. So that's why it's really critical when you do put it back on to use your visual to just get a line of sight on it, and make sure that you line it up back in there, and then hold it firmly to the base when you put the nut back on, because you don't want that shaft moving in and out and causing this plate to ride up cockeyed on one of these tabs here. So this is much easier now. At this point you can see where you're at, and I would recommend before you do anything, find the pattern that the old one's on and follow that just by going, here's the number 1 position where the trip line comes in, here's number 2 where it goes out, it comes around the spring reel, comes back in at number 3, and then last but not least, the tab is locked down on the swage is locked down under the tab on that part of the control head. So this is much easier to work with. Here you've got slack that you can pull out. You can get some of that slack from outside the spring reel, worked all the way around, so you can get it back in through hole number 3. And working it off, you can then remove the trip line much easier through these 3 holes, back through number 2, and I'm going to take those off for 1 sec. Back through number 2, and last but not least, out the first hole. Now you can replace that spring reel. If you're changing out the trip line, just remember that after you take this out, you want to make sure you put the new one back through the barrel of the trip block here. And actually, I recommend people take that trip line before you even connect it to the spring reel, run the bullet all the way up here, and find out right away if there's any issues with that bullet being tight inside the barrel. If there's not enough tolerance there, you may need to pull that line out, ream out the barrel with, usually I'd use a round file with some emery cloth wrapped around it. That's enough. This is cast aluminum. You don't need a lot of work on there to take out any tightness. So once you've got your trip line off, same thing. You've already marked your positions, so you know you're coming in through position 1, out through position 2. You're going to want to take some of that slack up because you'll need all that on the other end. So you're coming now through hole number 3, and at that point it's fairly simple to just move this cable out of the way, because you got the spring reel off now. You can see exactly where it's going, and now you've locked it in under tab 4. So before you move on, you want to take that slack and push it so that that swage is sitting nice and firm up against the tab like that. You don't want any gap between this tab and the swage. And you also want this swage sitting nice and flat against the bottom surface here, because as this plate spins, or as the spring spins, this plate will tend to hit onto this swage. So if it's up too high in this kind of position here, like that, it's going to be in the way of that metal plate. So make sure that it's as flat as you can get it on the bottom. If necessary, if it doesn't seat properly, don't hesitate to take it off again. Take it out the 3rd hole one more time. You might have to do this 2 or 3 times if it doesn't seat up properly. And now that your trip line's out there, give it a 45-degree or 90-degree twist in the cable, and just by doing that, you're realigning where this cable is going to lay when it comes through here. So instead of it pointing up, when I turn it 45 like that, now when it goes in, it'll be laying down. So that's all you need to do to get that swage end to lay down nicely on the bottom of the spring reel. So again, work that in, and then you're going to work out all this slack here. Make sure that it's nice and firm against that swage, pull all the slack so that this line is nice and tight on the center of the hub. And now you've replaced your trip line. If you're out in the field, take your base, visually line up that metal tab so that it sits nice and flat on the base of the control head, and reinstall your nut. The manual says approximately 35 foot-pounds for torque. I find with the box end wrench that it's like a good forearm strength turn of the nut. Once you get this tightened down to where you've taken up most of the threads, you're looking at really, you know, about as tight as you can get it with forearm strength. So now you got to remember your rule of thumb for resetting the tension on the spring reel. And the rule of thumb is 6 and 6. So you still want your trip line loose here. You're going to turn your spring reel once or twice here, because sometimes the spring will resettle itself inside and you'll hear a clicking as you turn it. You might hear some clicking or snapping. But that's just the spring actually just reseating itself in there. And once it's in the neutral position, just find your mark. This one is sitting, I would call this at 3 o'clock. The wind direction is stamped right into the spring here, so you can't go wrong with that. And mark this as your 0 point, and then turn it 6 turns, and then 6 wraps of the spring reel. So there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's 6 turns. And you want to work out any of those twists that are in the cable. You want to just pull them out of the control head so that they aren't sitting there inside the control head. Now that you got your spring reel in the right place, you want to hold it in place, and again, hand over hand, you put 6 wraps of the trip line on this model. Anything 210 US gallons or larger has no pulley on the trip line, and the rule of thumb is 6 turns and 6 wraps. The bullet normally ends up around this point here, from 1 foot to 1.5 foot outside the control head. That's about exactly where that trip line will end up with 6 and 6. And that's the right amount of tension for the spring reel as well. So we'll put on our wraps. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Our trip line is a little bit longer. I may have miscounted because I was trying to start while talking about another topic. I'd like it around here, so I'm not going to hesitate to add 1 more, because 6 and 6 is your rule of thumb. That's about where that trip line should be, right there outside the control head. So if I've miscounted, I'm gonna assume that I've miscounted and just add 1 more wrap to get it to this area here. And then the last step is just to wind all the trip line out off the spring reel, let it reseat itself under spring tension so it's nice and tight around the hub of the spring reel. So that technique is not in the manual. I think it's a great rule of thumb. Like I said, 6 and 6 or 6 and 12 on the small buckets that have the pulley. And the pulley looks like this, and it's located just down at the end of the bucket, and this trip line will run through the pulley and then connect back up here to the control head. So for these types of buckets, you're looking at 6 turns of the spring reel and 12 wraps.